This is Todd from OneShot API, and in this video we are going to go over the basics of using the Uniswap protocol in n8n workflows. And essentially this video has two sections. The first is going to be setting up your OneShot API account so that you can make on-chain reads and writes from your n8n workflows. And then the second, we're going to cover specifically which smart contracts you need to call and how to call them from inside of your n8n workflows. And this diagram here is kind of meant to give you a visual picture of what this is going to look like. Inside of our n8n workflow, we're going to set up a OneShot API execution node, and with that we're going to be able to fetch quotes from the on-chain Uniswap DEX protocol, and with that information we get back from the quotes, we'll be able to use that to execute swaps in the Uniswap pools. And we're going to be doing this using USDC. We're going to swap USDC into wrapped ETH. Both of these are ERC20 tokens. So if you want to swap between any other token pair, the procedure will be exactly the same. I'm just using USDC to keep it as simple as possible so that we can focus on the mechanics of the Uniswap protocol rather than on the tokens themselves. So with that, if you go to oneshotapi.com, log in, create a free account if you don't have one already. The first thing we're going to need is a OneShot API server wallet, so come to the Wallets tab, and if you don't have any wallets yet, click Create a New Wallet, give it a name and a description, and then we're going to be doing this on the base chain. The procedure we're going to walk through will work exactly the same on any of these other chains that Uniswap is deployed on, but we're going to do this on base network, again, to keep it as simple as possible. Hit confirm, and that will provision you a new server wallet, which I already have. So I'm going to be using this wallet, and you can see I've deposited a little bit of base ETH into it. It's a very small amount, but that'll actually cover a lot of transactions. So put a little bit of base ETH, $1, $2 worth, and that will cover many transactions in your trading algorithms that you're going to build in n8n. And then once we've got that wallet provisioned, we now need the smart contracts that we want to interact with. So for that, this is a really nice page in the Uniswap docs. I've put the link to this in the YouTube description. If you click on this, this gives you links to the different chains that Uniswap is deployed on and the addresses for the contracts. And it says here, please do not assume that contracts are deployed at the same addresses. That's really important. So we're going to select base because that's where we're going to be working. And then we're going to be using these two contracts, the QuoterV2 contract and the SwapRouter02 contract. These will let you price trades before you perform them. So the Quoter contract does exactly what it sounds like. It gives you quotes based on the input and output tokens that you're going to be using. And then the SwapRouter02 actually does the swaps. So we're going to use these two smart contracts. Now there's two ways you can import these. You can copy the address and then inside of OneShot API, come to My Smart Contracts and hit import. Paste the address here and then select base, and you can import the smart contract methods this way. The easier way is to come to OneShot prompts and filter on the base network, and you can see here, here's the Uniswap SwapRouter02 and here's the Uniswap QuoterV2. We want the methods from these two contracts, so I'll click on the quoter first, and I will create methods for all of the functions in this contract. Coming back, do the same thing for the swap router. And then lastly, like I said, I'm going to use USDC and wrapped ETH for this example. So inside of USDC, the only function that I really need is the approve function. So I'm going to add that one. Create an endpoint. And then for wrapped ETH, we'll find that one. Come to the second page, wrapped ETH. All I need is the approve method, so I'm going to add that one to my methods as well. Now if I come to my smart contracts, here's all of the methods that I need now to use the Uniswap protocol from inside of my n8n workflows. So let's move on to that next. If you log into your n8n account and create a new workflow. The first thing is that we want to add a one-shot API community node. So if you hit the plus button and then search for one-shot API, if nothing shows up, you'll need to install the one-shot API node. So we have a video on how to do that. Basically go to your user settings and community nodes and search for the one-shot API community node there and install it. Once you have one-shot API showing up here, the first thing we want to cover is getting a quote. So we're going to be calling the quoter contract. So if we do the one-shot API node and we scroll down here to contract method actions, we want to simulate a smart contract method call. So the quoter contract in particular is not meant to be executed. It's meant to be simulated so that I can get an estimate of how much token will I get out for a given amount of token in. So if this is your first time using the one-shot API node, you will need to create a credential. So to create a credential, up here at the top, hit the create a new credential button. You need your client ID, secret, and your business ID. The way to get that is to come to the API keys tab, create a new API key, key and secret, go here. The business ID comes from the top right-hand corner of your one-shot API portal. Paste that here, hit save, and then you will now have a credential that will authenticate you against your one-shot API account. So we're going to be simulating in order to get a quote. So if we now look at our methods that we've imported, here's the Uniswap QuoterV2 methods. The one that I want to use is quote exact input single. So we're doing a single swap, and we're going to be basing the quote on an exact amount we want to put in. There's another method here called quote exact output single, which again is for a single swap, but you're doing the quote based on how much I want of the token out. It'll give you an estimate of how much you have to put in. So for this tutorial, since it's the basics, I'm going to do the arguably simpler path, which is quote exact input single. So we're going to be calling this method, and now we need the input parameters. So the input parameters we can get from my smart contracts. If we go to the details of the quoter contract, hit details on this method, and you can see this is what it takes. It takes a params struct, which itself consists of a token in, token out, amount in, fee, and a square root price limit x96. So we need to input these values into our n8n node. So I'm going to do that. Okay, so I've got my skeleton of my input parameters here, and the fee value, this will switch on different pools that are set up for your trading token pair. So other values you can use, you can basically use 300, you can use 500, or you can use 3000. For this tutorial, I'm going to stick to 500 bips for the fee to select that pool. The square root price limit x96 is kind of an esoteric value, but this is how prices are represented at the contract level. These aren't really human readable. It takes a little bit of math to convert these into, USD or in raw token units. But for fetching the quote, to keep it simple, at the quote stage I recommend leaving this 0 so that we can see for a given swap, for an amount in of our token, what would be the effective square root price if I executed this trade. And then we're going to use the output that comes back to put a protection on our swap when we execute it. So now we need the token in and the token out. And the token in we're going to use as USDC, and the token out we're going to use as wrapped ETH. So we can get those contracts again from the one-shot API portal. Coming back to my smart contracts, USDC base, I'll copy that address, put it here. The token out is wrapped ETH, so I'll copy that address, paste it here. And then for the amount in, this is in atomic units of the in token. So it's USDC. USDC has 6 decimal places. So I'm going to pretend to swap $2. So I'll do 2 with 6 zeros behind it. And then this here is all I need in order to fetch a quote from the Uniswap protocol on the base network. So if I hit execute, you can see here it returned some information to us. It returned this decoded data, and the way to interpret this decoded data back in the OneShot API portal, if I come to the details page of the quoter contract and hover over quote exact input single, what it's returning is the amount that you would have gotten out had you performed the swap, the square root price x96 after the trade executes, ticks crossed, so how many ticks in this protocol did you sweep through in the V3 protocol, then approximately how much gas would have been used if you performed this trade. So if we look back over here, it's saying the amount out, this is the amount out in wrapped ETH. Remember, wrapped ETH has 18 decimal places, so if we're swapping $2 worth, that's actually not very much ETH, which is what we expect. The square root price x96, we're actually going to use that to protect us from downside, or when we perform the swap in a few minutes. This swap would have hypothetically crossed 1 tick in the Uniswap pool, and it would have cost approximately 80,000-ish gas to do this. So that's our quote. Now the next thing we would need to do in order to perform a swap in n8n is we need to approve the smart contract that is our entry point. We need to approve it to spend our funds. So here, let's add another OneShot API node, and specifically we want a submit and wait node because we want to send a transaction that will approve the router, and we need to wait for that approval to be confirmed before we can actually swap with it. So let's click that and hit execute a contract method. Make sure your credential is pointing at your OneShot API account, and then we can search here for approve. If you end up in a situation where you've got two functions named exactly the same thing, this can happen sometimes. Just come back into OneShot API, and then for, let's say, USDC, click on the details of the approved function, hit edit, and then the description up here will just say USDC approval function update. Then if we click out and back in, there we go, USDC approval function. And this function takes a spender and a value. So we'll open this up, spender, value, and we'll put in 200,000 for $2. And then the spender is going to be the swap router. So the swap router, back to my smart contracts, is this guy. So copy that address, place it here, and now we can hit execute. And it doesn't actually matter whether or not we have any USDC in our wallet to perform this. We can approve without actually having the funds, just so you're aware of that. Calling approve on a token that you don't actually have any balance of is valid. You can do this. And we haven't actually deposited any funds into our base wallet yet, but this is going to be executing, remember, as our base server wallet here. So I can hit execute, and you can see here it completed. And if I come to the transaction history tab, there is my approve transaction that I submitted just now. You can additionally, and I recommend doing this, add a memo field to your OneShot API nodes when you are executing transactions, so that when you're looking at your transaction history, it's easier to tell why you performed that transaction. So I'll just put here USDC approval for Uniswap Router02. So that's the approval step. And the next thing that we would do after this is we would actually do the swap. So again, I'll add a OneShot API submit and wait node, and we'll do execute a smart contract method, and then we will do the Uniswap SwapRouter02 exact input single. And again, this is going to look similar to the quote, but it has a few other input parameters. So coming back over here, details on the swap router. Here, it's going to take a params with these inputs. So let's go ahead and put that in n8n. Okay, and so now my input parameters match what the One-Shot API portal is telling me that this exact input single function expects to take. So let's look at them briefly. So just like the quote step, we have a token in and a token out, as well as the fee. So we'll put fee, we used the 500 bips fee for the quote, so we'll put 500 here. Token in and token out, that's going to be USDC and wrapped ETH, so let's put those in. Okay, the recipient, we want the tokens to go to our server wallet. So our server wallet is this address. The amount in from our quote was $2, so there's $2 right there. Now, amount out minimum and square root price limit, these are meant to protect you from MEV attack. So if you put both of these to 0, this is basically saying do an open swap, don't put any protection, which makes it simpler to call, but it's also dangerous if you're going to be doing this with any, significant amount of money. If you're doing this with thousands of dollars, I would get nervous if I just left these totally open. So I'll leave amount out minimum to 0 because we're actually going to use the square root price limit from our quote to protect us on the price that we're paying for this. So the easiest way to do that is over here in your input pane, go back to your simulate step, and then this value here, this is your simulated swap price that you would have gotten had you done it when you got the quote. So we're going to use that, and the fact that the time between the quote and the swap is very small, for the most part, this price will cover us. So let's remove the 0 and take this decoded data 1 value. We're going to put that here. And you can see this turns the parameter into an expression. And if you look at the resolved value here, you can see it puts that value straight in there for you. So it's kind of like a no-code, or is a no-code way to build parameter inputs to smart contract writes. And then lastly, like I said, we're going to put a memo field on it so that we know what we're doing. So this is a USDC swap into wrapped ETH. Okay, so when we execute this trade, we'll see that memo show up in our memo field. And now at this point, we're basically ready to run this. But before we do that, we do need to put some USDC into our server wallet so that we have funds to perform the swap. So I'm going to copy my server wallet address, and then from my self-custodied wallet, I'll go to USDC and send a few dollars worth. I'll send $5. There we go. So now we have funds in our server wallet, and we can now execute this simple n8n Uniswap workflow. So again, before we run it, review. When we click start, first we will fetch a quote for this token pair for this amount, this fee, not putting a limit on the square root price because we're going to use the value coming back to us. We'll then perform an approve step. We're giving approval to Uniswap's swap router. And then finally, once that transaction confirms, we will actually perform the swap, protecting ourselves with the quoted price limit from the quote step. So let's give it a shot. First, save it, and then let's execute. Okay, and you can see that it completed. If we come back to One-Shot API and go to transaction history, here is our approve step, and here is our swap step. And if we look at the transaction details and go to logs, here's the transfer from USDC and wrapped ETH. So the swap happened as intended. Here's our memos so that we know why those transactions occurred. And that covers the entirety of the basics of swapping any token pair that you want with Uniswap. You can do this now in n8n following these directions. The last thing I'll cover, you can skip this section if you're happy with what you saw, but we can actually make this a little bit more efficient. We actually did this transaction or this swap in 2 steps, where first we performed a approve and then we performed a swap. We can actually combine these into a single transaction using the batch node type. So if I type in One-Shot API back to our submit and wait, we can execute multiple smart contract methods at once. I'm going to select that option. And then here we will perform this batch transaction with our base wallet, and then we'll select the same methods that we selected before, approve, and we'll do here the second transaction, exact input single on the swap router. Save that. We can copy the exact same input parameters from here. Let's take this, paste it here, save it. This, paste it here. Make sure that's an expression. Hit save. And what this block will do now is it will automatically upgrade my OneShot API server wallet to a MetaMask Smart account, which will allow the server wallet to perform multiple actions in a single transaction. So if you are performing an approve, there's a little bit of time between the approve transaction being sent and your swap transaction being sent, and in times of high network congestion, your price can actually change enough to mess up your protection limit. So this really reduces the number of failure modes you can encounter in your, so we're doing a approve and we're doing a swap, and then I also, like I said, and then this would work exactly the same as this two-step trading workflow worked before. You can see it completed back over here in our transaction history. There's our combined approve and swap. You can see that it performed the swap for us in one go. So thanks for watching that. Again, this was kind of a long video, but we covered the entirety of the basics of using the Uniswap protocol inside of n8n. If you have questions, ask the team in Telegram, and watch out for other tutorials coming from us soon.